His phone wouldn't stop vibrating in the cup holder, rattling against an empty Starbucks cup that had gone cold an hour ago. Ben kept both hands on the steering wheel anyway, like if he gripped it hard enough, he could keep his life from sliding off the road. "Just read it," his older brother, Ray, said from the passenger seat. Ray's knee bounced so fast the whole dash seemed to shake with it. His eyes were fixed on the small, gray shed ahead, sitting crooked on the edge of their new land like it didn't belong to anybody. Ben's screen lit up again. Unknown number. Same as the last 3 calls. He swallowed, tasted stale coffee, and whispered, "It's probably the county." Ray exhaled through his nose like a laugh that didn't make it out. "Everything is probably the county now." Ben killed the engine. Silence rushed in. Then Ray reached across, took the phone, and answered on speaker before Ben could stop him. "This is the recorder's office," a woman said, flat and tired. "Sir, we need to discuss an issue with that parcel you just purchased." Ben stared at the shed's rusted padlock. A single tear slid off his chin and landed on the steering wheel, darkening the worn leather. And then Ray opened the truck door. They bought the land for less than a used car. It was 10 acres outside a small town near Dayton, Ohio, an hour from the highways and far enough from the city that your phone signal came and went like it had a mood. The listing had been one blurry photo and a few lines of text that sounded like a warning more than an invitation. As is. No utilities. Cash only. The price was so low Ben assumed there had to be a catch. Ray saw it as the first thing that had gone their way in years. The truth was simpler. Nobody wanted it. The previous owner had died. The heirs didn't live nearby. The county wanted it off the books. The land sat there, growing weeds, collecting old tires and windblown trash, waiting for someone desperate enough to believe they could start over on dirt that didn't cost monthly payments. Ben and Ray were desperate, just in different ways. Ben was 26 and still working the overnight shift at a big box warehouse, the kind of place where the lights were always bright and the air always smelled faintly of cardboard and cleaning spray. He had learned how to move like a machine because machines didn't get tired, and tired was dangerous when you were counting pallets and thinking about rent at the same time. His apartment was a 1-bedroom he shared with Ray in the city, a place with thin walls and a neighbor who played TV loud at midnight. Every month they paid on time and still felt behind. Ray was 31 and had the kind of exhaustion that sat on his face even when he smiled. He did HVAC installs when companies called him back, but calls had gotten scarce. Some weeks he worked 5 days, some weeks 1. He had a girlfriend once who asked him what the plan was. He told her he was working on it. She told him she couldn't live inside, working on it, forever. She left, and he didn't blame her, but he also didn't know where to put the feeling. So he put it in motion. New ideas. Side hustles. Plans that lasted until the next bill came in. When Ray found the listing, he texted Ben 3 screenshots with a bunch of all-caps messages like he'd discovered buried treasure. "This is it, we buy this and stop bleeding rent, we can build something small we can breathe." Ben didn't answer right away. He was at work, his back aching, staring at a time clock like it had personally wronged him. Breathing sounded nice. But his mind went straight to the part that always came next, the part where hope turned into a fee, a deadline, a problem he didn't know how to fix. Still, 2 weeks later, they were sitting in a cramped office with beige walls and a tired-looking clerk who didn't make eye contact. Ray slid an envelope of cash across the counter like he'd been waiting his whole life to do it. Ben watched the clerk count the bills with the slow care of someone who'd seen too many people try to outrun their circumstances. The deed was real. The parcel number was real. The signatures were real. The land was real too, when they finally drove out to see it for themselves on a gray Saturday morning in late November. The sky was low and heavy. The bare trees looked like they were reaching up for something they couldn't quite touch. The air smelled like wet leaves and cold dirt. Ray got out first, boots sinking slightly into soft ground. He spread his arms wide like he could hug the whole field. "Look at this," he said, voice cracking just enough that Ben pretended not to notice. "This is ours." Ben stepped out slower. The quiet out there didn't feel peaceful to him at first. It felt unfamiliar, like a room you didn't know how to behave in. In the city, sound was constant. A truck backing up. Sirens far away. Somebody yelling into their phone. Here, there was just wind and the occasional creak of branches. Ben walked a few steps and stopped near the shed. It wasn't a charming old barn like in the movies. It was small and slumped, made of weathered boards that had gone gray with age. The roof dipped in the middle. Rust streaked down the hinges like tears that had dried long ago. Someone had nailed a piece of plywood over a broken window, and the nails were crooked, like they'd been hammered in with frustration. Ray came up beside him, hands in his hoodie pocket. "It's fine," Ray said quickly, like he was talking to himself more than Ben. "We tear it down later. Or we fix it. Whatever. It's storage for now." Ben stared at the padlock. It looked new compared to everything else, shiny in a way that didn't match. That bothered him. New things meant recent attention. Recent attention meant someone had cared enough to keep something in or keep someone out. He looked at Ray. "You sure this place was abandoned?" Ray shrugged. "It was on the county list. You saw it." Ben nodded, but his stomach didn't relax. He had learned not to relax around paperwork. Paperwork had taken their mother's car after she got sick and missed payments. Paperwork had taken their apartment when Ben was in high school and Ray was working 2 jobs trying to keep them afloat. Paperwork was always clean and calm while it ruined you. Ray pulled out his phone, opened the camera, and started recording. "All right," he said, speaking into the lens with forced cheer. "First day on the land. Step 1, we figure out what we're working with." Ben turned away. "Can you not do that?" Ray lowered the phone a little. "Why not? We can post it. People like this stuff. Before and after. It could help. If it takes off." Ben cut him off, softer than he felt. "I don't want people watching us try to survive." Ray's face tightened, like Ben had tapped a bruise. For a second, the older brother look slipped away and Ray looked like a kid again, the one who used to promise everything would be okay while he hid past due notices in a drawer. "Fine," Ray said. He put the phone away too fast. "No posting." Ben wanted to apologize, but the words got stuck. He didn't know how to say, "I'm scared," without it sounding like he was blaming Ray for dreaming. A gust of wind pushed through the field. The shed made a small, complaining sound. Ray rubbed his hands together. "Let's just open it." Ben didn't move. "Maybe we call the county first. Make sure." Ray walked to the door anyway. He tried the padlock, tugging it like it might come loose from sheer confidence. It didn't. "Of course," Ray muttered. "Of course it's locked." Ben's phone buzzed in his pocket, and his whole body reacted like it was a warning siren. He pulled it out. Unknown number. He stared at the screen, thumb hovering. The cold air made his hands feel clumsy. Ray watched him. "Answer it." Ben swallowed. "What if it's bad?" Ray's jaw flexed. "Then we hear it. We don't hide from it." Ben tapped accept and put it on speaker, because hiding was pointless with Ray standing right there, and because part of him wanted Ray to hear it too, like sharing the weight might make it lighter. The woman's voice came through, flat and official, like she was reading from a script she didn't write. "This is the recorder's office," she said. "We need to discuss an issue with that parcel you just purchased." Ray's eyes went wide, but he kept his face still, like he was holding it together with invisible tape. Ben's throat tightened. "What kind of issue?" There was a pause, a paper shuffle, the small sounds of a government office that never stopped being a government office. "Before we get into details," the woman said. I need to confirm your names. And I need to ask something else. Have you been to the property yet? Ben looked at the shed, at the 2 new padlock, at Ray's hand resting on the door like he was afraid it might disappear. Yes, Ben said, voice barely steady. We're here. Another pause. When the woman spoke again, her tone changed just slightly. Still official, but careful, like she was stepping around something fragile. Okay, she said. Then I need you to listen closely. There is a recorded document tied to that land that was never properly delivered. It references a storage structure on site. Ray leaned in, almost whispering. What does that mean? Ben's chest felt tight. Are you saying someone left something here? I'm saying, the woman replied, that whatever is in that shed may be connected to the legal status of your purchase. And it may also be connected to a person named on the file. Ray's face drained a little. Ben didn't know why, not yet, but he felt it too, like a shift in the air. The woman continued, Does the name Evelyn Harper mean anything to you? Ben's heart stumbled. He hadn't heard their mother's name from a stranger's mouth in years. His eyes slid to Ray, and Ray stared back like he'd been punched quietly, from the inside. No, Ben lied automatically, because his brain didn't know what else to do. Then his voice broke. Yes, that's our mom. The line went silent for half a second, and in that tiny gap, Ben realized something he didn't want to realize. This land wasn't cheap because it was worthless. It was cheap because it had been waiting. Ray's hand dropped to his side, trembling slightly. His lips parted as if to speak, but nothing came out. He looked at the shed again, and this time it didn't look like a nuisance. It looked like a message that had taken years to arrive. The woman cleared her throat. I'm going to ask you one last question before I tell you what the document says. Do you have bolt cutters with you? Ben stared at the padlock. Ray stared too, like the lock was the only thing keeping their life the way it was. Ben didn't answer right away. He felt the fear, yes, but underneath it was something else. A strange, painful pull, like grief reaching forward in time. Ray finally whispered, I can get them from the truck. Ben nodded, because his voice was gone. Ray turned and walked back toward the pickup, each step slow, like he was walking toward a version of their past he'd spent years trying not to touch. Ben stayed by the shed alone, phone still on speaker, cold air burning his nose. And for the first time since they'd bought the land, Ben let himself believe that whatever was on the other side of that door was going to change them. Not in a magical way. In the real way. The way truth always does. The bolt cutters felt heavier than they should have as Ray carried them back across the uneven ground, and Ben noticed how his brother's shoulders were tight like he was bracing for something he could not name, and the shed stood quiet in front of them looking smaller now that the moment had arrived, and the wind moved through the field again carrying the smell of damp wood and old leaves. Ben stayed close but did not touch the door because touching it felt like crossing a line, and his phone was still warm in his hand, though the call had ended minutes ago, and the woman from the office had promised to call back later after they opened the shed and confirmed what was inside, and her voice had not been kind or cruel, just careful like she had learned that some truths needed space to land. Ray fit the cutters around the lock and paused, and Ben saw his jaw tighten and his eyes close for a second like a short prayer that did not ask for miracles, just strength. And when the lock snapped open the sound was sharp and final, and echoed more than it should have in the open air. The door creaked when Ray pulled it open, and the smell came first old paper dust oil, and something faintly familiar like the inside of a storage unit that had not been touched in years, and light spilled in slow and uneven, revealing shelves along the walls stacked with boxes and a small metal desk pushed into the corner, and everything looked organized, not abandoned, and that detail made Ben's chest tighten because someone had cared enough to put things in order. They stood there without stepping inside, and Ray finally laughed, but it was thin and shaky, and he said, I thought it would be junk, and Ben nodded because he had thought the same, and junk would have been easier than this. Ben moved first, and his boots made soft sounds on the dirt floor, and he ran his fingers over the nearest box and read the label written in neat, careful handwriting, Evelyn Harper, and his throat closed, and he pulled his hand back like the name might burn him. Ray stepped in behind him slower now, and when he saw the label his face changed, not dramatically, not in a way that looked good on camera, but in the quiet way grief always showed up for him. His eyes went glassy, and his shoulders dropped like he had been carrying something heavy for years and only now realized it was allowed to rest. They did not speak right away because speaking would turn the moment into something real, and Ben focused on details, the way his mother used to write labels, the way the desk drawer was half open, the way a folding chair sat against the wall like someone had planned to sit and think for a while. Ben opened the desk drawer and found a small stack of envelopes tied with a faded ribbon, and his hands shook as he lifted them, and the top one was addressed to Ray and Ben together, written in the same familiar handwriting, and dated nearly 10 years ago. Ray swallowed hard, and said, "You read it?" And Ben shook his head, and said, "No, you," and Ray took the envelope with hands that did not quite stop shaking, and opened it slowly like rushing might tear more than paper. The letter was simple and direct like their mother had always been when she was trying not to scare them. She wrote about the land, about how she had bought it quietly years before she got sick using money she saved from extra shifts and small sacrifices they never noticed. She wrote that she did not want them to know at the time because she did not want to give them hope she might not be around to see grow. She wrote that the shed held things she wanted them to have, not things worth much money, but things worth understanding, and she wrote that life had a way of making people feel small and tired, and she wanted them to remember that even when everything felt like it was closing in, there was still room somewhere to stand and breathe. Ray sat down hard on the folding chair and covered his face, and Ben stood there feeling both too full and empty at the same time, and neither of them cried loudly because that was never how they did things. They just let the tears come quietly and wiped them away like something private. After a while, Ben walked back outside because the air inside felt too thick, and he leaned against the truck and stared at the field, and his phone buzzed again, but this time it was not the county. It was a text from a number he did not recognize saying, "Hi, this is Mrs. Collins from the house down the road. I saw your truck and wanted to say hello." Ben hesitated, then replied, "Hello, we just bought the land," and almost immediately another message came through, "Welcome then, and if you need water or a bathroom, mine is open." The simplicity of it surprised him, and when Mrs. Collins appeared a few minutes later walking slowly with a thermos in her hand, she looked exactly like the kind of neighbor you never expected to have anymore, and she asked gentle questions and did not pry, and when Ben mentioned his mother she nodded like she had known her, and said she used to sit out here sometimes just listening. Ben felt something loosen in his chest at that, and when Ray joined them he looked tired but lighter, and Mrs. Collins handed him the thermos and said, "Your mom was proud of you boys," and it was not said like a grand statement, just a fact, and that made it feel real. As the sun dipped lower and the shadows stretched across the land, Ben realized that nothing magical had happened. They were still broke, still unsure, still carrying old fears, but they were no longer alone with them, and the shed no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a hand reaching back through time, offering understanding instead of answers, and that felt like enough for now. Night settled slowly over the land, and the sky turned dark without drama, and Ben sat on the truck tailgate staring at the faint outline of the shed, while Ray stood a few steps away scrolling through his phone without really seeing anything, and the quiet felt heavier now because there was space for thoughts to speak louder. Ben kept replaying the letter in his head, not the words exactly, but the feeling behind them, the way his mother had planned something without telling them, the way she had believed they would need it later. And the realization hurt in a place he did not know existed because it meant she had known how hard life could be for them, even back then. Ray finally broke the silence by saying, "I should have done more," and Ben knew what he meant because Ray had always carried that belief like a debt that never cleared, and Ben said, "You did enough," but Ray shook his head slowly and said, "I was supposed to protect her and you, and instead I was just trying to survive." Ben felt something tighten in his chest because he had spent years believing the opposite, that Ray had always been the strong one, the one with answers, and now hearing his brother admit fear made Ben realize how alone Ray must have felt pretending to be solid, while everything underneath was shaking. They went back into the shed with a single work light plugged into a small generator Ray had borrowed, and the soft yellow glow revealed more boxes, each labeled with dates and short descriptions, photos, bills, notebooks, and small items wrapped carefully in cloth, and Ben opened one box and found a stack of unpaid medical statements, and he felt anger rise fast and sharp, not at anyone specific, but at the system that made sickness feel like a personal failure. Ray noticed and said quietly, "I didn't know it was that bad," and Ben replied, "She never told us because she didn't want to be a burden," and the word burden hung in the air heavy and unfair, and Ben thought about how often he had felt like one himself when rent was late, or when he needed help, and the thought made his stomach twist. They found an old voice recorder next, and when Ben pressed play their mother's voice filled the small space steady but tired, and she talked about ordinary things like the weather and the land, and how she liked the quiet out there, and then her voice cracked just once when she said, "I worry about you boys forgetting yourselves trying to keep up with a world that never slows down." Ray sat on the floor, then back against the wall, and stared at nothing, and Ben felt the breaking point arrive not as a sudden collapse, but as a slow, overwhelming wave, and he realized he had been running for years from the idea that stopping meant failing, and now surrounded by proof that even their mother had needed a place to stop, he felt exposed and unsure. Ben stepped outside again because the shed felt too small for what was happening inside him, and he walked until the truck was just a shape in the distance, and the field stretched wide and empty, and he felt very small standing there under a huge sky, and he let the thought surface that scared him the most: what if nothing changes? What if this is all it ever is? He thought about his job, the endless shifts, the way his body moved on autopilot, the way dreams felt childish now, and he realized he was tired, not just physically, but deeply tired of measuring his worth by how little he needed from others, and the realization scared him because it meant he had been denying himself rest and care for a long time. Ray joined him quietly and stood beside him and did not speak at first, and then said, "I don't know what to do next," and Ben was surprised by how much relief that sentence brought, because it meant they were standing in the same uncertainty together, and Ben replied, "I don't either, but maybe we don't have to know right now." They stood there listening to the wind, and far away a dog barked, and the sound made the world feel normal again, and Ben felt a small shift inside, not hope exactly, but acceptance that not knowing was allowed, and that trying to control everything had only made him feel more alone. Back at the shed, they closed the door gently, not like they were locking something away, but like they were giving it space, and Ray said, "Maybe this land isn't about building something big," and Ben nodded, and said, "Maybe it's about not feeling trapped anymore," and that thought stayed with them as they drove back toward the city, the headlights cutting through darkness, and both brothers quiet but not heavy. Ben looked at Ray at a stoplight and saw exhaustion there, but also honesty, and for the first time Ben understood that the breaking point was not a failure, it was a moment when pretending stopped, and something more real had room to exist, and that realization followed him all the way home, settling in like a truth he could no longer ignore. Weeks passed and life did not suddenly change shape, but something inside both brothers shifted enough to make room for breathing, and Ben still went to the warehouse at night, and Ray still waited for job calls, but the weight felt distributed now instead of sitting on one chest alone, and that difference mattered more than either expected. They began driving out to the land every Sunday morning with cheap coffee in travel mugs and a small list of tasks that never felt urgent, and sometimes they only stayed an hour clearing trash or sweeping the shed floor, and sometimes they stayed longer sitting on overturned buckets talking about nothing important, and those quiet hours became an anchor in weeks that still felt unstable. Ben noticed that he slept better on Saturdays after being out there, and he stopped waking up with his jaw clenched, and his phone clutched like a warning device, and Ray noticed he laughed more easily even at himself, and the laughter did not feel forced or sharp, it felt tired but honest. They did not rush to build or plan or turn the land into something impressive, and that choice surprised people when Ray mentioned it at work, and someone joked about missed opportunity, but Ray only shrugged, and said not everything has to pay off right away, and saying it out loud felt like reclaiming something he had lost. Ben began taking pictures again, not for social media, but for himself, photos of sunlight hitting the shed wall, photos of Ray bent over a toolbox, photos of empty space that felt full, and he realized he was no longer afraid of watching his own life unfold slowly. One afternoon Mrs. Collins stopped by again with a small basket of apples, and she sat with them on folding chairs and told stories about their mother that were ordinary and kind, and hearing her described as a person instead of a memory helped ease something tight inside Ben, and Ray listened quietly, letting the past exist without trying to fix it. They found a notebook in the shed they had missed before, filled with small goals their mother had written, nothing grand, just reminders like take breaks and forgive yourself and ask for help when you need it, and Ben copied one line into his phone because it felt like something he needed to carry with him every day. The small win came quietly, the way most real ones do, when Ray got a steady offer from a local company that liked his work ethic and wanted someone reliable, and the pay was not amazing but it was consistent, and when he told Ben he did not smile wide, he just exhaled like he had been holding his breath for years. Ben made a small change too. He asked his supervisor about switching shifts to something that let him see daylight more often, and the answer was not immediate, but the question alone felt like progress, and when the schedule finally adjusted, Ben realized how much the night had been draining him. They did not celebrate with anything fancy, just burgers eaten on the tailgate watching the sun dip low, and Ben thought about how success used to look like escape to him, and now it looked like stability and presence, and Ray said quietly, "I think Mom wanted us to stop punishing ourselves," and Ben nodded because he felt that truth settled deep and steady. As winter approached, they covered the shed roof with a tarp, and fixed the door hinge, and each small repair felt symbolic without being dramatic, proof that care did not need to be loud to be real. And the land looked the same to anyone passing by, but to them, it felt claimed in a way paperwork never could. Ben stood alone there one evening after Ray left early, and he listened to the quiet, and thought about how worth was not something earned through exhaustion, and how asking for rest did not mean giving up, and he wished more people talked about that part of life, the slow rebuilding that nobody applauded. When he locked the shed and walked back to the truck, he felt a calm that did not erase fear but sat beside it without panic, and he knew there would still be hard months and unexpected bills and moments of doubt, but there was also this place and the understanding it carried. Driving home, Ben thought about how many people were carrying silent weight and how small acts of care could shift entire paths, and he hoped that anyone hearing their story might pause and consider where they were pushing too hard and where they might allow themselves space. The land did not make them rich, and the shed did not hold a miracle, but it held something quieter and stronger: permission to slow down, to value themselves beyond survival, and to believe that persistence did not always mean pushing forward. Sometimes it meant standing still long enough to remember who you were, and that lesson stayed with him long after the road lights blurred past and the city came back into view, inviting the next chapter one steady step at a time.